The training vessel's Starweaver tore through the atmosphere of Valdris 7, like a wounded bird falling from the sky, and metal screamed as hull plates ripped away in the violent descent, and inside the ship alarms blared while cadets scrambled to reach emergency pods, but there was no time, and the impact came hard and fast, and everything went darkly. Morgan opened her eyes and tasted blood and dust, and around her the broken remains of the cadet bay lay scattered like a giant had thrown toys across a room, and she pushed herself up on shaky legs and took stock of the situation, and 3 other cadets were stirring nearby. While emergency lights flickered in the smoke-filled air, the human cadet checked herself for injuries and found only bruises and a cut on her forehead that had already stopped bleeding, and she grabbed her backpack from where it had wedged against a wall and was relieved to find her camera still intact. Inside and outside the shattered viewports, she could see an alien landscape painted in shades of purple and red lily, made her way to the nearest exit, and the air that rushed in when she opened the hatch was thick and humid and smelled like copper and rotting flowers, and she stepped out onto soil that seemed to pulse with bioluminescent veins, and the sky above was a swirling mass of orange clouds lit by constant lightning. Other survivors began emerging from the wreckage, and Lily counted 12 cadets total, including herself, and most were injured but mobile, and a tall Quellan medic named Kira Vale was already moving between them and checking vitals with practiced efficiency, and her forearms worked quickly to apply emergency medical patches. The pilot, Jake Brooks, stumbled out last, and his blue skin had gone pale with shock, and he kept muttering about system failures and sabotage and how none of the controls had responded in those final moments before impact, and Lily filed that information away for later, because right now, survival mattered more than blame. Then something moved in the sky above them. At first, Lily thought it was just another cloud formation, but then the shape banked and turned with clear purpose, and it was massive and dark and circled the crash site like a predator evaluating prey, and the other cadets saw it too, and panic rippled through the group. Someone shouted to take cover, but before anyone could move, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing sheet. Was tall and elegant with silver hair that seemed to shimmer in the strange light, and her skin had the faint luminescence that marked her as Etherne, and one of the ancient elf-like species that rarely left their homeworlds. And her armor was black as night and etched with flowing script that hurt to look at directly. Seraphine Night Whisper raised one hand toward the sky and spoke in a language that sounded like wind through crystal, and the massive shadow above responded immediately and descended in a controlled spiral, and the downdraft from enormous wings scattered ash and debris across the clearing. The aid dragon landed with surprising grace for something so large, and its scales were deep red with edges that glowed like cooling lava, and smoke curled from its nostrils as it regarded the gathered cadets with intelligent amber eyes, and Lily found herself reaching for her camera on pure instinct. Burwing, the dragon was called, and Seraphine approached it without fear and placed her hand on its massive snout, and the bond between them was obvious in the way they moved together and how the dragon lowered its head to allow the Etherne to whisper in its ear. The other cadets were frozen in shock and fear, because dragons were supposed to be extinct and had been for thousands of years according to galactic records, and yet here one stood breathing and real and bonded to a cadet who had been on their ship before anyone could ask questions. The forest around them erupted, with movement. Creatures poured from the purple undergrowth, and they were all teeth and claws and moved with horrifying speed, and they were the size of wolves, but built like nightmares in their hides. Were armored with bony plates, and their eyes glowed with predatory hunger. Jake screamed, and several cadets tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The creatures were too fast, and they closed the distance in seconds, and the first one leaped toward Kira, who raised her arms in futile defense. Then, damn, Emberwing roared. The sound was unlike anything Lily had ever heard, and it resonated in her bones and made her teeth ache, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the force of it, and the attacking creatures faltered mid-stride, and some actually turned to flee. Seraphine moved like liquid shadow, and her blade appeared in her hand from nowhere, and she was among the creatures before they could recover, and her strikes were precise and lethal, and each movement flowed into the next without wasted motion, and she danced through the pack like death. Given four-member wing joined the fight and swept creatures aside with powerful swipes of clawed feet, and when several tried to flank, Adafini the dragon breathed fire, and the flames were white-hot and so bright that Lily had to shield her eyes, and the creatures caught in the inferno didn't even have time to scream. The battle lasted less than a minute. When it was over 24 creatures lay dead or dying, and Seraphine cleaned her blade with a cloth from her Belton showed no signs of exertion, and Emberwing settled back on haunches and began grooming Scales with apparent disinterest. The cadets stared in stunned silence. Lily was the first to speak, and her voice was steady despite everything, and she simply said, "Thank you," and Seraphine turned to regard her with eyes that were unnaturally blue and ancient despite the young face. Ethernay studied Lily for a long moment and seemed surprised by the human lack of fear, and she nodded once and said they needed to establish shelter before nightfall because the creatures would return in greater numbers after dark. Jake found his voice and demanded to know what was going on and why Seraphine had a dragon and what this planet was and why. She seemed to know it, and his words tumbled over each other in rising panics. Her fiend remained calm and explained in a flat tone that Valdra 7 was classified as a death world by the Galactic Union, and that their crash here was either incredibly unlucky or deliberate, and that they needed to survive long enough for rescue to arrive, and that meant following her instructions without question. Kira asked how long rescue would take, and Seraphine said it depended on whether their distress beacon survived the crash and whether anyone was close enough to receive it, and in the worst case it could be weeks. Other cadets absorbed this news with varying degrees of despair and fear, and some began arguing about what to do and whether to trust Seraphine, who had clearly been hiding her dragon and her knowledge of this place. Lily ignored the arguments and walked to the edge of the clearing and examined the alien flora with interest, and she noticed that some of the plants grew in spiral patterns and that bioluminescent fungi clustered near sources of water, and that the soil had an odd texture that reminded her of volcanic Asha. Pulled out her camera and started taking pictures. Seraphine appeared beside her with unsettling silence and asked what she was doing, and Lily said she was documenting the ecosystem because it was fascinating, and also because if they were going to be here a while, she might as well learn what was edible and what was deadly. The Ithernay stared at her and asked if Lily understood that this was a death world and that the mortality rate for unprotected visitors was 97% within the first week, and that most species couldn't even breathe the atmosphere for long without protective. Girly shrugged and said she grew up in Australia and had spent summers camping in Alaska, and that one semester in the Amazon had been pretty rough too, and compared to a saltwater crocodile, these creatures seemed pretty straightforward, and at least the gravity here was comfortable. Seraphine continued to stare, and something that might have been respect flickered in her ancient eyes, and she said that humans were either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, and she had not yet determined which. Lee grinned and said probably both, and asked if she could take a picture of Emberwing because the lighting was perfect right now with the orange clouds behind the dragon, creating an amazing silhouette. The Ethernay seemed at a loss for words and simply nodded, and Lily approached the dragon with calm confidence, and Emberwing watched her with curious eyes and allowed the human to move around and find the best angles for photographs as the sun began to set and the sky turned darker. Shades of red and purple. Seraphine organized the cadets into work groups, and some gathered debris from the ship for shelter, while others searched for water under Kira's supervision, and Jake worked on the distress beacon with shaking hands. Lily helped where she could but kept her camera ready, and she captured images of strange plants and unusual rock formations, and Emberwing watching over them all like an ancient guardian, and Seraphine moving through tasks with inhuman efficiency. When night fell completely, the forest came alive with sounds, and glowing eyes watched from the darkness, and the cadets huddled near a fire that Emberwing had started with a casual breath, and they took turns keeping watch. Lee sat next to Seraphine during the first watch and asked quietly how long the Ethernay had been bonded with Emberwing, and Seraphine was silent for so long that Lily thought she would not answer. Finally, the elf warrior said that Emberwing had been her companion since childhood, and that dragons were not extinct as the galaxy believed, but hidden and protected by her people, and that she was part of an order sworn to guard certain secrets and certain places. Lily asked if Valdra 7. Morning on Valdra 7 came with twin suns rising over the horizon and painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the forest seemed less menacing in daylight. though the creatures still watched from shadows and kept their distance from Emberwing. Jake had worked through most of the night on the distress beacon, and his efforts finally paid off when the device crackled to life and began broadcasting their coordinates. But then something unexpected happened, and the beacon picked up another signal. Coming from somewhere on the planet itself, the signal originated from the north, and Jake triangulated its position to somewhere beyond a mountain range that dominated the horizon, and the transmission was old and weak, but definitely artificial, and potentially their best hope for survival if it led to supplies or shelter or a way off this world. Serafini studied the readout with an expression that Lily had learned meant the Ethernay was worried about something she was not sharing, and when asked directly if she knew what the signal was, Seraphine said only that they needed to investigate it immediately. Kira objected and said that several cadets were still injured, and that moving through hostile terrain was dangerous, and that they should wait for rescue, but Seraphine cut her off and said rescue might not come for weeks or months, and by then they would be dead. The Ethernay explained that the planet atmosphere was slowly toxic to most species, and that without proper environmental suits their bodies would begin breaking down within days, and that food and water on this world were contaminated with compounds that required special processing, and that the emergency supplies from the wreck would last maybe a week if they rationed carefully. This news sparked fresh panic among the cadets, and arguments broke out about what to do and whether to trust Seraphine and whether splitting up might improve their chances. But Lily stood, and her voice cut through the chaos. She said they were wasting time, and that arguing accomplished nothing, and that Seraphine clearly knew more about this place than anyone else, and that following her advice seemed smarter than wandering around hoping for rescue. And besides, she wanted to see what was making that signal. Several cadets looked at Lily like she was crazy, but others nodded, and slowly the group agreed to make the journey, and they spent the morning preparing and gathering supplies and packing what they could carry from the wreckage. The trek north began at midday, and the group moved in a tight formation with Seraphine on point and Emberwing circling overhead and providing aerial reconnaissance, and Lily walked near the front and kept her camera ready and documented everything. The terrain was brutal, and the ground was uneven and covered with plants that had thorns or emitted caustic sap, and twice they had to detour around sinkholes that bubbled with yellow gas, and Jake used a scanner to detect safe paths through the hazard zone. The second day they reached a swamp, and the water was murky and smelled of sulfur and things moved beneath the surface and left ripples that suggested considerable size, and Kira wanted to go around, but that would add days to their journey. Seraphine said they would cross, and that she would go first and test the depth and safety, and Emberwing landed nearby and watched with protective attention as the Ethernay waded into the dark water and moved. With careful steps, Lily followed without hesitation and ignored the gasps from other cadets, and she entered the water and found it warm and unpleasant against her skin. And she kept her backpack held high to protect her camera. Something brushed against her leg beneath the surface, and Lily froze and then slowly reached down and touched scaled hide that was rough like sandpaper, and the creature beneath seemed curious rather than aggressive, and she made soothing sounds and kept her movements. Seraphine had stopped and turned to watch, and her hand was on her blade, but Lily waved her off and continued making friends with whatever lived in the swamp, and after a moment the creature surfaced and revealed a head like a crocodile mixed with a turtle, and its eyes were intelligent and calm. The cadets on the bank stared in disbelief as Lily scratched under the creature's chin, and it made a rumbling sound that might have been pleasure, and then it swam away and left them alone. And Lily continued across the swamp like nothing unusual had happened. When everyone had crossed safely, Jake asked Lily how she had known the creature would not attack, and she said she had not known, but that most predators gave warnings before attacking. And this one had seemed curious, and that crocodiles back home were way more aggressive. Seraphine studied Lily with renewed interest and said that humans were either blessed by fortune or insane, and Lily said both were probably true. On the fourth day they reached the mountains, and the signal was stronger now, and coming from somewhere beyond the peaks, and the climb was difficult, and the air grew thinner and colder as they ascended, and some cadets struggled with the altitude. Lily was reminded of hiking in Colorado and pushed forward with steady determination, and she helped others. When they faltered and shared water from her canteen and took pictures of the view from higher elevations and the way, the clouds seemed to flow like rivers. Through the valleys below, Borwing could not fly well at this altitude and walked alongside them, and the dragon massive feet left deep impressions in the rocky soil, and occasionally Seraphine would ride on the dragon back to scout ahead. They camped that night on a narrow ledge with a sheer drop on one side and a rock face on the other, and the wind howled past them and threatened to push the unwary over the edge, but Emberwing positioned itself as a windbreak, and the cadets. The dragon warmed scales. Lily sat with Seraphine during watch again and asked about the War of Reckoning that the Itherne had mentioned once before, and Seraphine was quiet for a long time. Before answering, she said it had been a conflict fought thousands of years ago, and that her people had faced an enemy that consumed worlds, and that the war had nearly destroyed the Itherne civilization, and that in the end they had won but at terrible cost, and that some things had been sealed away rather than destroyed because destruction was impossible. Illy asked what kind of things, and Seraphine said the kind that should never be found. Next morning, they crested the final peak and looked down into a vast valley, and in the center stood a spire of black obsidian that rose impossible high into the sky, and it was clearly artificial and ancient, and the signal was coming from inside it. The structure was massive and smooth and without visible seams or doors, and strange symbols covered its surface, and they glowed faintly with blue light, and as the group descended toward it, Seraphine grew increasingly tense, and Emberwing made low growling sounds that suggested unease. When they reached the base of the spire, Seraphine placed her hand on the surface, and the symbols flared bright, and text appeared in flowing Itherne script, and the elf warrior read the words, and her face went pale, and she stepped back quickly. Lily asked what it said, and Seraphine said it was a warning and a tomb marker, and that this place had been a battlefield during the War of Reckoning, and that something had been sealed here, that they needed to leave immediately. But Jake pointed out that the signal was still broadcasting from inside, and that there might be communication equipment or supplies, and that they had come too far to turn back now. And other cadets agreed and said they needed answers. Seraphine tried to argue, but Lily sided with Jake and said they should at least investigate, and that running from unknowns was not a survival strategy, and that knowledge was better than ignorance, even if the knowledge was dangerous. The Itherne looked at Lily with something between frustration and respect, and finally nodded and said they would enter, but that everyone must stay close and touch nothing without permission, and that at the first sign of danger, they would retreat. The entrance appeared when Seraphine spoke words in her ancient language, and a doorway formed in the smooth obsidian and revealed stairs descending into darkness, and the group lit portable lights and began the descent with weapons drawn and nerves stretched tight. The interior was vast and empty, and their footsteps echoed in the silence, and the walls were covered with more text and images that showed battles between the Itherne and creatures that looked like living shadows, and Lily took pictures of everything. While others explored, they found a central chamber, and in it stood a communication console that was still active, and Jake rushed forward and began accessing the system, and what he found made everyone gather close. The signal was not a distress call, and it was a warning beacon, and it had been broadcasting for centuries and telling ships to stay away, and that Valdra 7 was quarantined, and that something dangerous was imprisoned herein must never be disturbed. Seraphine closed her eyes and said she had feared this, and that her order had been sworn to guard this place, and that she was here because someone had sabotaged their ship and crashed them deliberately, and that someone wanted whatever was sealed here to be released. Lily asked what exactly was sealed here, and Seraphine pointed to the images on the walls and said they called it the Void Spawn, and that it was a bioweapon from the war, and that it adapted to whatever tried to kill it, and that it consumed all life, and that the only way to stop it had been to imprison it, and that if it escaped it would devour the planet and then spread to others. The chamber suddenly felt very cold. The cracks appeared at dawn, and they were thin lines spreading across the obsidian floor of the chamber like spider webs, and they glowed with sickly green light. And Seraphine saw them first, and immediately began shouting for everyone to wake up and grab their gear. The spire shook, and dust fell from the ceiling and somewhere deep below something roared, and the sound was wrong and made everyone nauseous and filled with instinctive terror, and Emberwing outside began bellowing in response. An alarm. Jake checked his scanner and went pale and said there was massive energy activity beneath them, and that something was moving up through the lower levels, and that the seals Seraphine had mentioned were breaking and they needed to leave. Right now the group ran for the stairs, but before they reached the exit, the floor exploded upward, and a mass of writhing shadows poured into the chamber, and it was unlike anything in nature and seemed to be made of darkness, given physical form. And it had too many teeth and too many eyes, and it moved in ways that hurt to watch. The void spawn had awakened. It struck fast and grabbed a cadet named Danny, who had been at the rear of the group, and pulled him into its mass, and his screams lasted only seconds before they cut off, and the creature seemed to absorb him and grow slightly larger, and its form shifted and changed. Seraphine moved between the creature and the remaining cadets, and her blade flashed and cut through shadow flesh, but the wounds healed almost instantly, and the void spawn lashed out with appendages that were sometimes tentacles and sometimes claws, and always deadly. Emberwing crashed through the spire wall and entered the chamber with fire and fury and the dragon. Flames washed over the creature, and it recoiled and screamed, but even as it burned, new flesh grew and replaced what was destroyed, and the healing was faster. And Lily pushed the other cadets toward the exit and yelled for them to run, and most obeyed. But Kira stayed behind and tried to help, and Jake was frozen with fear and could not move, and Lily had to physically drag him away while the medic provided cover. They burst out of the spire and into daylight, and behind them they could hear the sounds of combat and Seraphine shouting orders to Emberwing in her ancient language, and the dragon roaring in challenge and panda. Ground outside the spire cracked open, and more shadows poured out, and the void spawn was not contained in one body but seemed to exist in multiple places at once, and it spread like infection across the valley floor and consumed everything it touched. The fleeing cadets scattered and tried to reach high ground, but the creature was fast, and it caught another two before they could escape and absorbed them, and with each victim it learned and adapted and became more dangerous. Lily found herself separated from the main group with just Jake and Kira, and they were trapped on a rocky outcrop with the void spawn circling below, and its many eyes fixed on them with hunger and intelligence above them. Seraphine and Emberwing fought desperately, and the Ethernay rode her dragon now and directed its attacks with precision, and they worked as one unit. And their bond was the only thing keeping the creature at bay, but it was not enough though. Void spawn was learning and adapting to their tactics, and when Emberwing breathed fire, the creature developed heat resistance, and when Seraphine struck with her blade, the shadow flesh became harder and more resistant to cutting, and it was only a matter of time before they were overwhelmed. Lily watched the battle, and her mind raced, and she thought about predators back on Earth and how they hunted and what made them vulnerable, and an idea began forming, and it was crazy, but crazy was all they had left. She yelled up to Seraphine and told her to lead the creature away from the spire and toward the thermal vents they had seen on the approach, and Seraphine shouted back, asking why, and Lily said she had a plan but needed time. The Ithernay hesitated for only a moment, and then urged Emberwing into motion, and the dragon dove and snapped at the void spawn and drew its attention, and then flew hard toward the vents, and the creature followed, and its mass flowed across the ground in pursuit. It turned to Jake and Kira, said they needed to get back to the Starweaver wreckage and fast, and that she needed the remaining power cells from the ship drive, and Jake asked what for, and Lily said to make the biggest explosion they could manage. Understanding dawned in Kira's eyes, and she said it might work if they could lure the creature into the blast zone, and if the explosion was big enough, and if they could time it right, and that was a lot of if. Lily said she was open to better ideas, and when none came, they started running the journey back. Took hours, and they moved as fast as the terrain allowed, and behind them they could see Emberwing in the distance, and still fighting and still flying, and the dragon was tiring but holding on, and Seraphine's skill kept them both alive. the wreckage. Jake worked frantically to extract the power cells, and they were unstable and dangerous, and meant for controlled use in a ship drive, and not for making bombs. Desperate times required desperate measures. Lily helped him rig a detonator from emergency supplies, and they used medical cord from Kira Kit as a fuse, and the whole setup was crude and might not work, but it was all they had, and Jake said it would be enough if they could get the creature close enough. Other cadets had regrouped at the wreck, and they were 7 now instead of 12, and everyone was exhausted and scared and covered in cuts and burns, and they looked at Lily like she might have answers. She explained the plan and said they would use the thermal vents, its instability to their advantage, and that the planet itself was volcanic and active. That if they could trigger a chain reaction in the vents while the void spawn was close, then the resulting eruption would bury it. It was insane, and everyone knew it, but no one had better ideas, and so they loaded the power cells onto a makeshift sled and began dragging it toward the vents, and toward where Seraphine and Emberwing still fought. The battle had moved to a ravine near the thermal vents, and the ground there was hot and cracked, and steam rose from fissures, and the air shimmered with heat, and Emberwing was wounded now, and one wing hung at an odd angle, and Seraphine armor was torn, and she bled from multiple cuts. Void spawn had grown massive, and it filled the ravine, and its form was more solid now and more dangerous. And it had learned too much and adapted too well, and it moved with terrible purpose toward the dragon and Rider Lily. And the others arrived and set up their trap and placed the power cells around the largest thermal vent and rigged them to explode on Jake's signal, and then they had to somehow get the creature into position. Seraph saw them and understood immediately what they were attempting, and she nodded. And then she did something incredibly brave and stupid, and she drove Emberwing straight at the void spawn and landed in front of it and stood between the creature and escaped the void spawn, attacked with everything it had, and Seraphine met it with blade and fire, and Emberwing, despite injuries, fought with primal fury, and together they held the line, and slowly they retreated and drew the creature deeper into the kill zone. Lily watched and calculated and waited for the right moment, and her heart pounded, and she could see that Seraphine was faltering, and that Emberwing could not last much longer, and that if she waited too long they would all die. She gave the signal. Jake triggered the detonator. Power cells exploded with blinding light, and the force of the blast hit Lily like a physical wall and threw her backward, and the sound was deafening, and the thermal vents ruptured, and magma erupted from deep underground, and the ravine began collapsing in on itself through the chaos and fire. Lily saw Emberwing launch into the air with Seraphine clinging to the dragon back, and they were both on fire and trailing smoke, but alive and flying and getting clear. The void spawn tried to follow, but the ground beneath it gave way. It fell into the erupting magma, and it screamed, and the sound was terrible and full of rage and pain. And then the ravine closed completely and buried everything under tons of rock and superheated earth. For a long moment there was only silence except for the rumbling of the settling ground. Then Emberwing landed heavily, and Seraphine slid off the dragon back, and both collapsed, and Kira rushed to them with her medical supplies and began working to stabilize their injuries. Lily approached slowly and knelt beside Seraphine and asked if the creature was dead, and the Ethernay coughed and said she did not know, but that it was contained, and that the magma and rock would hold it for a while, and that maybe rescue would come. Before it could dig Freember, Wing made a low sound and nuzzled Seraphine with surprising gentleness, and the bond between them was clear and deep, and Lily pulled out her camera and captured the moment because it was beautiful. Despite everything, Jake reported that the distress beacon was still broadcasting, and that they had detected a response, and that a ship was on its way and would arrive in approximately 3 days, and the relief in his voice was obvious. 3 days seemed like forever, but it was better than weeks, and the group settled in to wait and to heal and to hope that the void spawn stayed buried that night. Lily sat with Seraphine, and they did not speak much, but the silence was comfortable, and they both watched Emberwing sleep and listened to the dragon breathing, and it was peaceful. Seraphine finally said that no one had ever destroyed a void spawn before, and that the best her ancestors had done was imprison them, and that Lily's plan had been insane and should not have worked. The rescue was supposed to arrive in 3 days, but on the second night the ground began shaking again, and from the sealed ravine came sounds that made everyone's blood run cold, and the void spawn was not dead, and it was digging. Jake monitored the seismic activity and reported that the creature was moving through solid rock and somehow tunneling toward the surface, and that it would break free within hours. And this time they had no trap and no plan and nowhere to run. Seraphine was still too injured to fight effectively, and Emberwing Wing had not healed, and the dragon could barely fly, and the remaining cadets were exhausted and low on supplies and morale, and Lily could see defeat in their eyes. She refused to accept it. Lily gathered everyone and said they needed to go back to the spire, and that the answer to killing this thing permanently had to be in the Ether records, and that running would only delay the inevitable, and that the only way forward was through. Kira protested and said the spire was dangerous, and that Seraphine had warned them, and that they should wait for rescue. But Lily pointed out that rescue would arrive to find them all dead unless they acted now. Raphine surprised everyone by agreeing with Lily, and she said that the spire contained more than just warning messages, and that there were weapon systems and knowledge that her people had sealed away, and that she had not accessed them before because the cost was high. Jake asked what cost, and Seraphine said that accessing the deeper archives would alert her people, and they would know she had broken her oaths and shared forbidden knowledge with outsiders, and that she would be exiled. Or worsely said that being alive and exiled beat being dead and honorable, and after a moment, Seraphine nodded and said she agreed. Group made their way back to the spire and moved quickly, because time was running out, and behind them, the ground continued to shake and crack, and the void spawn was getting closer inside the spire. Seraphine led them deeper than before, and downstairs that spiraled into darkness and staredness. The walls here were different, and covered with warnings in multiple languages, and some of the symbols hurt to look at directly. Reached a chamber that was sealed behind a door of pure energy, and Seraphine placed both hands on the barrier and spoke words that resonated with power, and the door flickered and then dissolved. Beyond was a library of sorts, but instead of books there were crystals, and they glowed with stored information, and in the center stood a pedestal with a single large crystal that pulsed with blue light. Seraphine approached it and hesitated, and then placed her hand on the crystal, and her eyes went white and information flooded into her mind, and she gasped and staggered, and Lily caught her before she fell. When Seraphine eyes cleared, she looked shaken and older somehow, and she said she understood now, and that the void spawn could not be killed by conventional means, and that it adapted too quickly, and that every attack only taught it how to defend better, but there was a weakness. Creature adapted based on patterns and prediction, and it learned from what attacked it, and developed counters, but it struggled with true randomness and chaos, and with things that defied logic. Logically understood immediately, and said that was why her explosive trap had worked, and because the thermal vents were unpredictable and the eruption was chaotic, and the void spawn had not been able to adapt fast enough. Effany nodded and said the ancient Ethernay had discovered this too late, and that by the time they realized the weakness, they had already tried every organized attack pattern, and taught the creature to counter them. All the only way they had one was by sealing the creatures away, because they could not kill them. But humans were different, and Lily had proven that, and her approach had been chaotic and unpredictable, and the void spawn had not seen it coming. Jake asked if they could do it again, and Seraphine said maybe, but that the creature would be more prepared now, and that they needed something even more chaotic and even more unexpectedly thought about it. And then grinned and said she had an idea, but everyone was going to think she was crazy, and Seraphine said that seemed to be a requirement for human plans. The idea was simple in concept, but insane in execution, and Lily wanted to use the Starweaver remaining fuel reserves and mix them with the planet's naturally volatile atmosphere and create a firestorm that would be completely unpredictable in how it spread. The fire would not follow normal patterns, and because the atmosphere had pockets of different gases and the wind was chaotic and the terrain was uneven and everything, would combine to create something that could not be predicted or adapted. Seraphine said it would work once and maybe kill the creature, but it would also likely kill them all because they could not control where the fire would spread. Lily said that was the point, and that they just needed to be somewhere safe when it happened, and Seraphine asked where exactly would be safe from a planet-wide firestorm. Lily pointed up. The spire was tall enough and strong enough, and they could seal themselves inside and wait out the flames, and then deal with whatever remained afterward. It was a terrible plan, and everyone knew it, but terrible plans were better than no plans, and the ground was shaking harder now, and the void spawn was close. They had maybe an hour. Cadets worked faster than they ever had, and they rigged every fuel cell and every bit of combustible material from the Starweaver and spread it in a pattern around the ravine, and Jake calculated wind patterns and atmospheric composition and placed charges to ensure maximum. Seraphine and Emberwing took to the air one last time, and despite the dragon injuries, they flew and they flew, and they carried the final explosive charges and placed them at key points, and Lily watched through her camera lens and captured the moment. Everything was ready. The group retreated to the spire and sealed the entrance, and Seraphine activated ancient shields that would protect them from heat and fire, and they climbed to the highest chamber and waited below them. The void spawn finally broke through and emerged from the ravine, and it was larger now and had absorbed the magma and rock and adapted. And its form was terrible and wrong, and it spread across the valley floor seeking prey. Jake triggered the chargers. The fuel ignited, and the atmosphere caught, and the resulting explosion was beyond anything they had imagined, and flames spread in impossible patterns and jumped gaps and changed direction without warning and consumed everything. The void spawn tried to adapt, but every time it developed heat resistance, the fire changed and became chemical flames instead. And when it adapted to that, the oxygen burned, and when it adapted to that, the ground itself ignited. The creature could not keep up and could not predict and could not survive. Through the spire windows they watched it burn and dissolve and finally collapse into ash. And the fire continued for hours and turned the valley into hell, but the spire held and the shields protected them. When it was finally over, when the flames had died, the valley was transformed, and the ground was black glass, and nothing lived, and smoke rose in pillars to the orange sky. Lily was the first to break the silence, and she said that was intense, and Seraphine laughed. And the sound was slightly hysterical, and said that humans were absolutely insane. The rescue ship arrived 6 hours later and found the cadets alive inside the spire, and found the valley destroyed, and found the remains of the void spawn scattered and lifeless. Galactic Union officials were shocked, and the Aethernay High Council arrived personally, and they were ancient and powerful, and they looked at Seraphine with disappointment and anger, but before they could speak, Seraphine stood tall, despite her injuries, and said she had done what was necessary to protect the cadets and to destroy a threat that her people had only been able to imprison. She said a human had shown her that sometimes the old ways were not enough, and that adaptation and chaos, and refusing to accept the impossible were weapons her people had forgotten. The High Council turned their attention to Lily and studied her with eyes that had seen millennia, and they asked if she understood what had happened here and what had been destroyed. Lily said she understood that something dangerous had been eliminated, and that her friends were alive, and that sometimes you had to burn everything to save what mattered. One of the council members, who was called Elder Moonwhisper, smiled slightly and said that humans were either a blessing or a curse to the galaxy, and that time would tell which. Seraphine said they were both, and that made them valuable. Council deliberated and finally declared that Seraphine had acted with honor, and that her bond with Emberwing had been tested and proven, and that the destruction of a void spawn was worth the breaking of old oaths. They also said that humanity had earned their respect and their attention, and that the Aethernay be watching Earth with great interest. As they prepared to leave Valdra 7, Lily stood with Seraphine and Emberwing and looked out over the transformed valley, and she raised her camera one last time. She captured the three of them together. Against the backdrop of destruction, they had survived, and Seraphina was smiling, and Emberwing was at peace. And Lily looked tired, but triumphant. It was the perfect ending to the craziest vacation ever. The journey back to civilization took 2 weeks aboard the rescue vessel Nightfall, and during that time, Lily worked on organizing her photographs, and the other cadets recovered from their injuries and tried to process what they had survived. Of their adventures spread quickly through the Galactic Union and news agencies. Wanted interviews, and military officials wanted debriefs, and scientists wanted to study the remains of the void spawn, and everyone had questions. Lily refused most requests and said she just wanted to go home and finish her cadet training and maybe take a real vacation somewhere boring, but she agreed to one interview. If they let her bring Seraphine and Emberwing, the interview took place on a neutral station called Haven Point and was broadcast across the galaxy, and the interviewer was a Quellan named Host Vex, who had 6 eyes and a reputation for asking difficult questions. Vex started by asking Lily to describe the experience, and Lily said it was interesting and educational, and that Valdris 7 had some beautiful ecosystems. Despite trying to kill them, constantly Vex asked if she had been afraid, and Lily said of course, but that fear was just information, and that acting despite fear was what mattered. The interviewer turned to Seraphine and asked about breaking her oaths and sharing Ethernay's secrets, and whether she regretted her choices. Seraphine said she regretted nothing, and that oaths meant nothing if you were dead, and that the void spawn would have eventually escaped regardless, and that at least this way it was destroyed rather than imprisoned. Vex asked about Emberwing and how a dragon had remained hidden for so long, and Seraphine said some secrets were worth keeping, and that her people had protected the last dragons because the galaxy was not ready for them. But now perhaps it was. The interview ended with Vex asking Lily what she had learned from the experience, and Lily thought about it and said she learned that every species had strengths, and that working together made everyone stronger, and that sometimes the craziest ideas worked best. She also said she had gotten some amazing photos. The interview went viral, and within days Lily was famous, and people across the galaxy were talking about the human who had treated a death world like a camping trip, and who had helped destroy an ancient evil with chaos. And fire job offers poured in, and research institutions wanted to study human psychology and military organizations wanted to recruit her, and Lily turned them all down. She did accept one offer, though. The Ethernay High Council invited her to visit their homeworld, to speak with their warriors, and share her perspective, and Lily agreed, because she wanted to see more of the galaxy, and because Seraphine would be there. The visit was scheduled for 6 months later, and that gave Lily time to finish her cadet training and to print her favorite photographs and to create a gift she worked with, a master bookbinder on Earth, and created an album and filled it with images from Valdris 7, and each photo had a small caption and told the story of their survival. There were pictures of the crash site, and of Emberwing first landing, and of the deadly creatures they had fought, and of the spire rising into the alien sky. There were photos of the cadets working together, and of Kira treating injuries, and of Jake fixing equipment with shaking hands, and of moments both terrible and beautiful. Centerpiece was a 2-page spread showing Seraphine and Emberwing in flight above the burning valley, and the dragon wings spread wide, and the Ethernay warrior silhouetted against flames, and it was breathtaking. On the final page Lily had written a simple message, and it said, "Thank you for showing me that friendship transcends species, and that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the best adventures are the ones you survive together." When she presented the album to Seraphine 6, months later on the Ethernay homeworld, the normally stoic warrior actually cried. They stood in a garden that glowed with bioluminescent flowers, and Emberwing lounged nearby and watched with contented eyes, and Seraphine turned each page slowly and relived the memories. She said it was the most precious gift she had ever received, and that humans had a way of capturing moments that made them eternal. Lily said that was the point of photography and of memory and of friendship. The Ethernay Council requested a copy of the album for their archives, and Lily agreed, but said the original belonged to Seraphine, always during her stay on the Ethernay homeworld. Lily spoke with warriors and scholars and shared her thoughts on survival and adaptation in chaos as a weapon. She explained that humans had evolved on a death world, and that Earth had shaped them to be flexible and creative and stubborn, and that those traits were their greatest strength. The Ethernay listened with fascination, and several suggested that humanity should be invited to join their order of guardians and help protect the galaxy dangerous secrets. Lily said she would think about it. but that first she wanted to finish school and maybe visit a few more planets. And definitely take a vacation somewhere with beaches and no carnivorous wildlife. Surfy laughed and said that with Lee definition of vacation, they would probably end up fighting pirates or exploring haunted ruins. Lily said that sounded perfect. In her last day on the Itherne homeworld, the High Council held a ceremony and formally thanked
Lily
for her role in destroying the Void Spawn and protecting the cadet. Selder Moonwhisper presented her with a crystal pendant and said it marked her as a friend of the Itherne and that she would always be welcome among them. Lily accepted with gratitude and said she hoped to visit again and bring more humans next time. And Seraphine said the galaxy was not ready for more humans like Lily. The elder laughed and said the galaxy would adapt or chaos would teach it. That night, Lily and Seraphine sat with Emberwing under alien stars and talked about the future and about what came next. To Seraphine said she would return to her duties as a guardian, but that she had requested permission to work with human forces sometimes and to learn more about their methods. Lily said Earth would be lucky to have her and that maybe they could partner on missions and get into more trouble together. Dragon made a sound that might have been amusement, and both women laughed before Lily left. She took one final photograph, and it showed her and Seraphine standing together, with Emberwing head between them, and all three were smiling, or as close as a dragon could smile. She titled it, Family, the Return Journey to Earth gave Lily time to reflect and to write in her journal and to organize her thoughts about everything that had happened. She realized that the experience on Valdres 7 had changed. Hearn had shown her that the galaxy was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than she had imagined. She also realized that despite the danger and the fear and the near-death experiences, she would do it all, again, without hesitation, because that was what it meant to be human and to embrace the unknown and to find beauty in chaos and to make friends in the most unlikely places. She finally reached Earth and stepped off the transport. Her family was waiting, and they embraced her and said they had been worried and that the news had made it sound much worse than it probably was. Lily said it had actually been worse than the news reported, but that she was fine and had made some amazing friends. Her younger sister asked if she had really befriended a dragon, and Lily said yes, and showed her the photos. Her brother asked if she was going back to space, and Lily said definitely, and that next time she would be better prepared. Her mother asked if she had been scared, and Lily said constantly, but that being scared had not stopped her from living. Her father just hugged her and said he was proud that night. Lily uploaded a selection of photos to her personal gallery and wrote a blog post about the experience and titled it Best Vacation Ever. Shay described Valdres 7 without naming it and talked about the challenges and the beauty and the friendships forged in fire. Shay ended the post with a simple statement, and it said that the galaxy was full of wonders and terrors and that humans belonged among the stars, and that she could not wait to see what adventure came next. Post went viral within hours, and comments poured in from across the galaxy, and humans were inspired and aliens were amazed, and everyone wanted to know when Lily would share more stories. She replied that she needed to finish cadet training first, but that there would definitely be more adventures. Her room that night, Lily looked at the printed photos spread across her desk, and she smiled. There was Emberwing in flight, and Seraphine in battle, and the cadets working together, and the alien landscapes that had tried to kill them. There were moments of fear and joy, and exhaustion and triumph. There was proof that she had survived the impossible, and had done it with grace and humor and an unshakable belief that humans belonged anywhere they chose to be. She picked up the photo of her and Seraphine and the dragon and placed it in a frame on her desk where she could see it every day. It would remind her of what she had learned and of the bonds she had formed and of the truth that had become clear on that deadly beautiful world. Humans were not the strongest species or the smartest or the most advanced, but they were adaptable and creative and absolutely refused to give up, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. Lily fell asleep that night with a smile on her face and dreams of stars and dragons and friends who would last forever somewhere across the galaxy. Seraphine did the same and held the photo album close and whispered thanks to the universe for bringing a chaotic, stubborn, wonderful human into her life.